Here is the million-dollar question. Can the Ukrainian economy survive the Russian invasion? Let's put it another way. How could the Russian invasion affect Ukrainians living in unoccupied territories? Will they be able to continue their businesses, or will they be living regulated to living just hand to mouth? Putin was not satisfied with invading eastern Ukraine and launched his invasion in all parts of the country. How things will end, nobody knows. We don't have a crystal ball here at Visual Politic. But we do have something else, a long memory. Because yes, my Visual Politic friends, there is a precedent very similar to Ukraine, a country that was also invaded by Putin. Which country are we talking about? Georgia. And no, I'm not referring to the US state, but to the country Georgia with its capital in Tbilisi. Does this mean the Ukrainians are going to suffer the same fate as the Georgians? No. But you can't deny there are a lot of similarities. What's more, Georgia can teach us a lot of lessons. If you are a digital nomad or someone who is interested in that kind of lifestyle, you've probably heard this country mentioned 1,000 times. It is one of the trendiest destinations for small entrepreneurs and digital nomads. Almost as trendy as our unique t-shirts. T-shirts that are part of our exclusive merchandising. Well, that's merchandising that is not for sale. The only way to get one is by joining our Patreon patron scheme at level 3 or above. I mean, come on, these t-shirts are really exclusive. All the designs are created by us. In other words, if you join Visual Politics Patreon, you will not only help this project go ahead with all the independence and rigor that you like so much, but you'll also get access to these cool threads with our political, weekly, analyst newsletter as well, which is a real treat. But let's get back to today's story. The truth is that Georgia is one of the most interesting countries in the world, particularly to this man you see on the screen right now. Meet the former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. If this man had been born in San Francisco, I assure you there would be at least 3 series about him on Netflix. I think he's the only politician in history who can boast of having held positions of political responsibility in 2 different countries. One is Georgia and the other, Ukraine. After ruling Georgia, Saakashvili obtained Ukrainian citizenship and became governor of the Odessa region. Absolutely everything in this man's life is worthy of a movie. No matter whether you like him or not, nobody can deny that he is a unique character in history. A man who arouses passion and hatred. And who is his biggest hater? It's Vladimir Putin. And take note, because we are talking about real hatred. Pay attention, because this is a direct quote.
Someday, I'm going to hang Saakashvili by the balls. Vladimir Putin in 2008.
Yikes! If Putin says that, I mean, you've kind of got to be scared, don't you? And why so much hatred, you might ask? Well, the truth is that 1/5 of Georgia's territory is occupied by Russia, and it has been that way since 2008 when the Georgian War broke out. That's right, you could say that Georgia is a miniature Ukraine. So the question is, why are so many digital nomads opting to live in an invaded country? Has Georgia survived the Russian invasion? What lessons can Ukrainians learn from this story? What mistakes has Georgia made? Today, we're going to answer all these questions, but before we do, many of you have asked us how you can help the Ukrainian army. And there is a way to do it. The Ukrainian National Bank is accepting donations from private individuals like you and me. This money will go to support their troops and the resistance to the Russian invasion. This is not a paid sponsorship. No one is paying us to tell you this, and we are mentioning it just for the sake of informational purposes. That said, let's look at some history.
Borat's village.
As I mentioned before, if you're a digital nomad, you've probably heard of Georgia. Or maybe you're there right now. Georgia is a poor country, but at the same time, they have requested to join the European Union. This is quite the fairy tale outcome when you consider that 20 years ago, Georgia was, how should I put this? Have you seen Borat? Well, next to Georgia at the time, Borat's village would have looked like Manhattan. The country was the crystallization of all the stereotypes you might have in your head of an ex-Soviet republic. Underworld gangs, corruption, and poverty. During the Cold War, Georgia was a republic within the Soviet Union. Then, in 1991, they declared independence and went to war with Moscow. Much like what is currently happening in Ukraine, Georgia has 2 provinces whose population feels more Russian than Georgian. We are talking about South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Since 1992, these are 2 of the regions that appear shaded with little lines on the maps. So, what happened to the rest of the country? Well, to be honest, nothing good. Many of you might think the end of communism was good news for everyone living in the former USSR. However, Georgia is one of the exceptions to this rule. To give you an idea, in just 10 years, Georgia's GDP fell to less than half. What's more, this country continues to suffer harsh population loss. In 1989, Georgia had about 5 million inhabitants. Now, it's down to 3.7 million. So how could things go wrong in this place, you might ask? I mean, think about it. In the 1990s, Georgia became the perfect breeding ground for organized crime and corrupt politicians, but that's not all. What little industry there was in the country came from Moscow. Once they became independent, all those factories closed down. To give you an idea, during the 1990s, the main Georgian export was the scrap metal left behind by the Soviets in the iron and the steel factories. That's right, Georgia's main export was the metal scraps left over from the factories that had just been closed down. With this one fact, you can imagine what the country was like. Then again, it's not surprising. We are talking about the Caucasus region. All the countries and regions in this area are the same or worse. In this region, there's Azerbaijan, Armenia, Chechnya. I mean, come on, we're talking about one of the most shadowy areas on the planet. However, Georgia's destiny changed forever in 2003. What happened at that time, you might ask? Well, we're gonna look at that right now.
The Rose Revolution.
There are moments in history when one person changes everything. This is one of those cases, and yes, the person in question is Mikhail Saakashvili, the guy we mentioned earlier. Some will say that this video is no more than a puff piece and a eulogy to the figure of this man. But, setting aside the opinion you might have about him, no one can deny that he has seen it all. Objectively, this man completely changed the history of his country. And I'm serious here. On Visual Politic, we have analysed a lot of countries and political figures. Saakashvili's life is a movie script. In today's video, we are only going to cover a small part of it, and it goes like this. Back in 2003, Saakashvili was a lawyer who had studied in the United States. While there, he became the greatest advocate of the West and the free market. Yes, my dear libertarian friends watching this channel, if there is one hero of the minimal state and libertarianism, it is none other than Saakashvili. In 2003, he led what we would call the most successful libertarian revolution of the last 100 years, the Rose Revolution. Let's admit one thing here. The way he came to power was not the most democratic in the world. But let's remember that Georgia was something like Borat's village, but turned up to 11. In any case, Saakashvili came to power with one promise: to turn Georgia into a free market paradise. That means anti-corruption, low taxes, and free trade agreements with the whole world. To give you an idea, his reforms were so radical that even the International Monetary Fund stopped lending money to the country. And why did they do that, you might ask? Because they thought that, with such low taxes, the country would be unable to pay back its loans. However, that's not what happened. Look at this graph. There you have it. Georgia has one of the most minimalist tax systems in the world. Remember our video about Estonia we did a little while ago? Well, Georgia follows an almost identical model. Add to that the free trade agreements and a cleanup of state resources. To give you an idea, Saakashvili even fired more than 16,000 corrupt policemen in the first years of his leadership. I know what you're thinking. This kind of sounds like Visual Politic's dream, doesn't it? I mean, yeah, it does. Of course, to many of you, it will sound like a horrible government program. But the truth is that the data speaks for itself. Between 2004 and 2007, Georgia's GDP grew by 35%, and international investment poured into the country. For example, it was in 2007 that Ferrero, the brand that manufactures Nutella, opened a plant in the country to process hazelnuts. That's right, one of Georgia's main exports is nuts. Nuts and wine. Georgia is known as the birthplace of wine. So within a few years, this country was exporting hazelnuts and wine like there was no tomorrow. And I know what you're thinking, that's the primary sector? Where's the industry? And yeah, you are right, but remember that Georgia came from being less than Borat's village. The important thing is that the country was on the right track. It was the star of the Caucasus. And then, that's when misfortune struck. Check this out.
Putin's first victims.
Another of Saakashvili's promises upon coming to power was national reunification. Georgians were not happy about having two basically independent provinces. It may sound strange, but despite being such a small country with less than 4 million inhabitants, Georgia has several different languages and ethnicities. And there are two regions where Georgian is not even wanted: South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And what, you might ask, do these regions have in common? Well, apart from having not much attachment to Georgia, they have huge affection for Mother Russia. That's right. This story might be starting to feel familiar to you. It is something almost identical to the Donbass or Crimea. But not only that, as you can imagine, it is hard to declare your undying love for the free market and the West without angering Russia. Especially when Saakashvili declared his explicit interest in joining NATO. As has happened with Ukraine, Putin's first attack came through the wallet. In 2006, Russia ordered a trade boycott against Georgia. And what comes after the wallet? Exactly, the military.
Russia and Georgia clash over separatist region.
That's right. In 2008, a group of South Ossetian separatists bombed a group of Georgian soldiers. Georgia had tried to negotiate a territorial solution that would allow the rebel regions to agree to become part of Georgia, but the negotiations had not worked. And this attack was the final straw. First, the Georgian army invaded South Ossetia. Then, Russia supported the South Ossetians, and that's how war broke out between Russia and Georgia. Like the war in Ukraine, Russia also reached the capital of Georgia. In fact, just like what happened in Kiev, the Russians also bombed the airport of the capital, Tbilisi. In just 12 days, Russia occupied almost the entire country, including parts with anti-Russian populations. Of course, there are now several differences between Ukraine and Georgia. First of all, the Ukrainian army has had almost 8 years to prepare for invasion. We've already talked about this in many visual politic videos. However, Georgia is also a much smaller country with a smaller army, making it ultimately easier to conquer. Invading all of Ukraine would take much longer than 12 days. The second difference is that the Ukrainian war has been much more deadly. Unlike Georgia, a big share of Ukrainian territory is already devastated and it's only getting worse and worse. This said, there are still some parallels between these two stories. In any case, what happened in Georgia in the end? Well, in this case, France mediated to negotiate a ceasefire. Russia got what it wanted, control of Abkhazia and North Ossetia. In exchange, they withdrew troops from the rest of Georgia. So in conclusion, what is the situation in Georgia today? Well, when you look at a map on Russian world maps, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are two independent republics. However, no other country recognizes them as such. So on the world maps drawn up by all of the rest of us, there are two territories shaded with dashes. And for practical purposes, these two republics act like two Russian provinces. They even use the ruble as legal tender. In other words, it seems very reasonable to think that Donetsk and Luhansk will meet a similar fate. And believe me, you wouldn't want to live in those areas. The question is, what has happened in the rest of Georgia? Have they managed to get on with their lives despite the war with Russia? Well, now we're going to look at that.
Between Russia and the West.
In 2013, Saakashvili lost the elections, and who would you guess succeeded him? Well, pay attention, because this story has a lot of colourful characters, to say the least. Saakashvili's successor was this gentleman you see on the screen. We are talking about Berdzina Ivanishvili, also known by the nickname Boris. Thank goodness, that is a difficult name to say. This nice gentleman made a tiny fortune selling computers to the Russians in the 1990s. And how big was his fortune, you may ask? Well, it is estimated that this man had a sum of money equivalent to 1/3 of the entire GDP of Georgia. That's right. And after making so much money in Russia, he returned to his native Georgia to try his luck in politics. In 2012, he created his own party, which he called Georgian Dream. And as you can imagine, with so much money for election campaigning, the Georgian Dream Party swept the elections the following year. But as if that weren't enough, after being defeated in the elections, Saakashvili was exiled and lost his citizenship. Side note, Saakashvili is one of the few examples of a person who became, technically, stateless. That is, for a couple of years, he had no nationality at all. But that's a story for another video. In any case, since 2013, Ivanishvili's party has dominated Georgian politics. And what ideology did this party have? Well, as you can imagine, Georgian Dream is as pro-Russian as a party can be in Georgia, which is to say, not much. As you might expect, most Georgians don't want to see Russia have even the slightest presence. It is the country they are technically still at war with. However, Ivanishvili is pro-Russian enough to pull off things like this.
Russia set to resume imports of Georgian wine and water.
But make no mistake, Georgia is still far away from the Russian sphere of influence. Yes, it is true, since 2013, Georgia has returned to trade with Russia, but that is not its only trading partner. Check this out.
European Union signs free trade deal with Georgia.
Exactly. Georgia trades with both Russia and the European Union. This explains not only the takeoff of its wines, which are increasingly exported, but it also explains the creation of a new economic sector that was unthinkable in this country just a few decades ago: tourism. And I know what you're thinking. Tourism? Who would want to go on vacation to a country that is at war? Well, look at this graph. The truth is that, before the pandemic, Georgia had almost 8 million visitors a year. The growth of tourism has been almost miraculous. Yes, it is true that the occupied areas are dangerous, but cities like Batumi have filled up with waterfront hotels, many of them financed by foreign capital. Georgia has become a relatively cheap destination for Russian and Turkish tourists. However, all that glitters is not always gold. Yes, it is true, Georgia today is much better off than it was 20 years ago. However, the country still maintains a 17% unemployment rate. In the last decade, they have hardly invested in education, and as a result, it is difficult for high value-added companies to emerge. There is no well-trained workforce. Not to mention that the system is becoming increasingly authoritarian. In fact, in 2021, they put Saakashvili in jail for rather obscure reasons, and Russia is still pushing to bring Georgia back into its sphere of influence. Then again, the Russian invasion of Ukraine might just change this trend. And just some days before making this video, Georgia has made an official request to enter both the EU and NATO. Shall they go through? At this time, it's really impossible to tell. However, one thing is certain. There are many lessons to be learned from Georgia. Sure, the Ukrainian economy will have a much longer path to recovery because, as we said, the share of the country is already devastated. Then again, Georgia proves that even under a Russian invasion, you can restore your economy. The question is, what can Ukraine learn from Georgia? Is it possible for the western part of Ukraine to become a model economy attracting investments? Will we see a tourism boom in Kiev? Could innovative industries emerge in Ukraine, despite the country being at war with Russia? You can leave me your answers in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here at Visual Politic, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to this channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like this video, like it so we know, and I'll see you next time.